More than 2 months later, and I am finally back for another chapter. This time, I believe it is part 2, chapter 3. The presence of Frank Hurley at this high-level meeting about the food situation had special significance. He was invited not because of his Antarctic experience. There were several others, such as Alf Cheatham or Tom Crean, who were much more knowledgeable, but because Shackleton did not want to antagonize him. The incident revealed one of Shackleton's basic traits. Though he was virtually fearless in the physical sense, he suffered an almost pathological dread of losing control of the situation. In part, this attitude grew out of a consuming sense of responsibility. He felt he had gotten them into their situation, and it was his responsibility to get them out. As a consequence, he was intensely watchful for potential troublemakers who might nibble away at the unity of the group. Shackleton felt that if dissension arose, the party as a whole might not put forth that added ounce of energy, which could mean, at a time of crisis, the difference between survival and defeat. Thus, he was prepared to go to almost any length to keep the party close-knit and under his control. Though Hurley was a skilled photographer and an excellent worker, he was also the sort of man who responded best to flattery, who frequently needed to be jollied along and made to feel important. Shackleton sensed this need. He may even have overestimated it, and he was afraid that unless he catered to it, Hurley might feel slighted and possibly spread discontentment among the others. And so Shackleton frequently sought Hurley's opinion, and he was careful to compliment him on his work. He also assigned Hurley to his own tent, which appealed to Hurley's snobbishness and also minimized his opportunities for gathering other latent malcontents around himself. Several other tent assignments were made with an eye to avoiding trouble. Shackleton shared number 1 tent with Hudson, the navigator, and James, the physicist, as well as Hurley. Although neither of these men was by any means a troublemaker, Shackleton seemed concerned that they might cause friction if they were in close contact with the others for too long. Hudson was just as he had always been, simple and a little irritating. His attempts at humor were often more foolish than funny because he lacked perception. He was a young dandy, a little impressed with his own good looks, but really not too sure of himself. As a result of this fundamental insecurity, he was quite self-centered and a poor listener. He could be counted on to interrupt any conversation to inject something about himself, even though what he said bore no relation to the subject being discussed. And his self-centeredness made it difficult for him to tell when his leg was being pulled, as was the case in the practical joke from which he got his nickname, Buddha. Strangely, he seemed to enjoy a joke on himself. At least it gave him the chance to occupy center stage. Shackleton was not at all fond of Hudson, but he preferred putting up with him to inflicting him on others. As for James, he probably never should have gone with the expedition at all. He had had an academic background and a rather sheltered upbringing. He was a scholar and an extremely capable and dedicated scientist, but in practical matters, he was very unhandy and a little unwilling. The adventurous side of the expedition, which was its chief appeal for most of the other men, interested James very little. In personality, he was roughly the antithesis of Shackleton. For James's own sake, as much as for any other reason, Shackleton took him into his own tent. The assignment of McNeish to number 2 tent under Wild's care was also a calculated move. As a ship's carpenter, McNeish was a master craftsman. Nobody ever saw him use a ruler. He simply studied a job briefly, then set to work sawing the proper pieces, and they always fitted exactly. But McNeish, though physically a giant of a man and proportionately strong, was 56 years old, more than twice the average age of the other expedition members, and he was troubled with piles. He was homesick too, almost from the day the expedition sailed. In fact, nobody really understood why he came at all. Whatever the reason, McNeish tended to be querulous, and because of his long experience as a mariner, he fancied himself something of a sea lawyer, well versed in the rights of seamen. All things considered, Shackleton felt McNeish could bear some watching, and he instructed Wild accordingly. But even dour old McNeish was happy during the blizzard, which blew up out of the southeast on November 6th. Though it kept the men in their tents and living conditions were miserable, they were certain it was giving them a considerable shove to the north. "We all hope it lasts for a month," McNeish wrote. It did last for 48 hours, and when the weather cleared, Worsley obtained a sight which showed they had been blown 16 miles northwest, a highly satisfactory run. That afternoon, Shackleton went back to the ship with a small pantry and 3 of the dog teams to continue salvage operations. But the Endurance had sunk another 18 inches and was just about level with the surface of the ice. Further salvage would be impossible. Just before leaving, the party fired a signal bomb as a salute and farewell to the Endurance. The men began the next day to build a lookout tower out of the odds and ends of spars and planking they had brought back from the ship. And McNeish went to work on a better sledge for the whaler, using some of the tremendously strong Greenheart sheathing that had once protected the sides of the Endurance from the ice. The days now were considerably longer than the nights, with the sun setting about 9 p.m. and rising again near 3 o'clock in the morning. In the evenings, there were plenty of light for reading or playing cards. Frequently, Hussey took his banjo around to the galley tent, where the flicker of flame in the blubber stove warmed his fingers enough to play, and there was always a good turnout of singers. The 7 men under Worsley's charge in number 5 tent instituted the practice of reading aloud each night. Clark was first, and he chose a volume inappropriately titled Science from an Easy Chair. Clark and his 7 listeners lay snuggling together for warmth, arranged in a circle around the tent with their feet thrust under a pile of sleeping bags to generate a little collective heat. When it came Greenstreet's turn, he elected to read Sir Walter Scott's Marmion, and Macklin aloud as how, I must confess, I find his reading an excellent soporific. Underlying the optimism and good spirits of the party was a deep-seated confidence that their situation was only temporary. Things were certainly to improve before very long. Summer was coming. They were positive that the drift of the pack, which had been at a creeping pace, would pick up speed. Even if it didn't, the summer weather would loosen the ice and they could take to the boats. On November 12th, 4 days after the end of the blizzard, the wind swung around to the north, and suddenly summer seemed to arrive. The thermometers rose to a record 35 degrees, and several of the men stripped to the waist to indulge in the luxury of a wash in the snow. Otherwise, the heat wave made living conditions increasingly miserable. During the daytime, it was almost stiffingly hot in the tents. Shackleton once recorded a temperature of 82 degrees in his. Worsley insisted that he could actually see the snow turning into water. The surface of the floe became a quagmire of melted snow and rotting ice. Walking was treacherous because the porous ice would unexpectedly give way, letting a man plunge into the water-filled ice pocket up to his knees or even his waist. Sledging heavy seals back to camp was worst of all. The drivers were usually wet through when they returned. But life had its compensations. Ordleys, the expedition's tight-fisted storekeeper, known to the men variously as the Colonel, the Old Lady, the Burglar, the Man of Action, and a host of other derogatory nicknames, decided on November 12th to move out of number 5 tent for a while. Worsley, with sarcastic relish, described the reaction in his diary. Sounds of bitter sobs and lamentations are heard this evening from number 5 tent at the loss of her dearly loved colonel, who has removed himself for a season to sleep in his store in the old wheelhouse. He indulgently yields to our earnest entreaties to continue to dine with us and comforts us with the assurance that he will return promptly to our humble but happy home immediately we prepare to get on the march. Of all the expedition members, Ordley's was undoubtedly the strangest, and probably the strongest too. Before joining the expedition, he had been physical education director of His Majesty's Royal Marines, and he could easily have whipped any of the other 27 men. Yet, for all the abuse his crewmates heaped on him, Ordley's was never provoked into a fight. He would usually reply in a hurt tone of voice, "Now really, you shouldn't say things like that." Still, he was anything but a coward. In fact, he almost foolhardy in the risks he took. But seal hunting, he would dash across leads of open water, leaping from one chunk of ice to the next while killer whales cruised around. Once during the darkest part of the winter, when the Endurance had been beset, he found a bicycle in the hold of the ship, and he went out for a ride across the frozen floes. He was gone 2 hours in the perilous cold, and a searching party had to go out to find him. When he was brought back to the ship, Shackleton ordered him thereafter never to leave unless he was accompanied by another man, and instructed Worsley to see that he obeyed. Ordley's had an enigmatic, childlike personality. He was fundamentally lazy, except for a few activities such as skiing, which gave him pleasure. But he was not ashamed of his laziness, and he made no effort to disguise it. Even in the most desperate circumstances, when other men were on the point of collapse from fatigue, he seemed to openly shirk his duty. It was perhaps only his guilelessness about it that made him tolerable to the others. As a storekeeper, however, he was excellent, at least under their meager circumstances. He suffered from a morbid fear of starving to death, so he was as miserly as possible with their stores. Several times, Shackleton reprimanded him for his ensuing insufficient food. He continually antagonized his tent mates. Frequently, when it was his turn to bring the pot of hoosh from the galley to the tent, he would get distracted along the way so that the food was cold when it arrived. No amount of pleading, curses, or threats could get him to improve. He saved everything, and his collection of clutter occupied much more space than he was entitled to. With Shackleton, however, he was obsequious, an attitude which Shackleton detested. Shackleton, like almost everybody else, disliked Ordley's intensely, and even told him so once. Characteristically, Ordley's dutifully recorded the incident in his diary, writing it in the third person as if he had been an onlooker during the conversation. For all his undesirable traits, however, Ordley's appeared to be incapable of malice. Most of the men wrote him off as a fool, so that when he was most infuriating, he was also rather ludicrous. Shackleton, who had been busily studying possible escape routes, announced on November 13th that he had formed a plan. Their drift thus far appeared to be carrying them directly toward Snow Hill Island, about 275 miles to the northwest. It lay off the coast of the Palmer Peninsula and was properly connected to the peninsula by ice. If the pack opened enough to let them launch the boats in time, they might land there. They would then be in a position to travel overland about 150 miles to the west coast of the Palmer Peninsula, eventually arriving at Wilhelmina Bay, a frequent summertime stopping place for whalers. Once contact had been established with the whalers, their rescue would seem assured. Shackleton planned to have a small party of 4 men make the overland journey across the 5,000-foot glaciers of the Palmer Peninsula, while the rest of the party waited at Snow Hill for rescue. There was no assurance that the plan could be put into effect, but even the remotest possibility had to be considered and exploited to the fullest. Hurley went to work filing down screws and fixing them as cleats into 4 pairs of boots for the men who might have to climb the glaciers. Shackleton himself pored over every available chart of the region, figuring out the best route. That night, as if to underscore the precariousness of their situation, a noise like distant, muffled thunder rumbled through the pack. A new wave of pressure had begun. About 3,500 yards away, they could see the ice once again attacking the ship. About 9 p.m., they heard the sound of a splintering crack, and looking over, they saw her foremast come crashing down, carrying the blue ensign with it.